All right, welcome. We'll be looking at the Industrial Revolution, its origins, the conditions that made Britain the epicenter for industrial development. Again, England here was the first country in human history and world history to industrialize. We'll look at the early industrialists themselves, kind of where their focus lay, um, and then also look at the technologies that were actually being developed during this period of time, during the early iterations of the Industrial Revolution itself. We'll also turn attention towards the consequences of industrialism, not only with regard to the relationship between the employer employee relationship, but also how this is going to lead to a rekindling of imperial competition, primarily with and between European powers. Again, England was the first. There would be a host of reasons why England would serve to be the first, but then there would be a host of reasons also why the rest of Europe would lag behind, and that it would be roughly, um, into the 19th century before much of the rest of Europe caught up or began the process of catching up with England. What that meant is that for England, it afforded them tremendous amounts of wealth that they were able to amass for themselves. For the rest of Europe, largely through things like political instability, revolutionary eras like the French Revolution, among other things, this meant that it was a climate that was hostile to innovation and to economic development. And so there would be different strategies employed once things calmed down on the continent to try and catch up with England as quickly as possible. So we'll begin to take a look at that towards the close of this particular lecture. And then also, moving forward, we'll take a look at how the industrial characteristics began to spread beyond Europe itself, primarily to places like the United States. But to begin with, it's important to understand the origins of this early industrial age, the first industrial age, you might say, and then also why, again, Britain had the characteristics, the kind of pieces in place in which from which they could begin to benefit from industrialization. So sustained signs of industrial growth began around the year 1750 in Britain, and oftentimes that's the year given or identified as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is heavily influenced by the recent agricultural revolution that was taking place, a process by which more food was available uh, and was provided at a cheaper cost with less labor. What this meant is that it allowed for a new round of population growth to take place. When people are secure and confident about where their next meal is coming from, they're more likely to have larger families. We would call this food security today. And so, as a result, England, benefiting from this agricultural windfall, meant that they were in place to have the population in place to serve as the source of labor needed for the industrial era itself, um, and also kind of a ready supply of the labor pool. So that was one characteristic that was in place. There are a handful of others that made Britain unique during this period of time. The second was that Britain was politically stable. The earlier revolutions of the 17th century, think the Glorious Revolution of 1688, meant that England was beginning to emerge on the other side of that tumultuous era. Pitting Catholic against Protestant in many respects, and the back and forth of the of the throne and the monarchy itself between Protestant and Catholic rulers. When that is finally resolved through the actions and the developments of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, this meant that England itself was in a good place as far as being able to deal with and accommodate and adjust to the rapid changes that were going to come about largely as a result of industrialization. Again, this is very emblematic of the modern age. That change comes at societies much more quickly. And so it's incumbent upon societies to begin the process of adjusting and assimilating themselves to it as best as possible. England did that better than virtually anyone else during this period of time. It is, in many respects, arguably the key difference between constitutional monarchies, of which England was an example, when compared to more absolutist monarchies such as France and Russia and other places in the continental portions of Europe. Again, why is that? Well, absolute monarchs and absolute monarchies are in a position of wanting to maintain the status quo, that they are adverse to any type of change, any type of risk. And so, what this means is that they may be less inclined, if not just completely opposed to embracing industrialization. Britain, on the other hand, being a constitutional monarchy, power was a bit more decentralized, a bit more diluted, through the parliamentary system that they had. And so what this meant is that there was a greater tolerance for things like risk or the trying to um, be more receptive to technological development, and kind of the unknowns that came about with it. Britain, thirdly, also had a an advanced banking system. And this was necessary because it allowed for the capital, the money, to be readily accessible for investment in technology and in industrial development itself. Again, engaging in and basically providing the funds for innovation is a risky endeavor. So you have to have the mindset for it, which Britain had as a result of the public and private sector mentality. But then you also need the money available, and you need to be able to have the financial system, the banking system available to make that money open for investment. And that's exactly what Britain had at its disposal. Britain, fourthly, also possessed the natural resources necessary for the industrial age. Coal and iron ore were basically the two central ingredients needed during the Industrial Revolution, the initial industrial age itself. Coal was going to serve as the fuel to power the industrial age initially, and iron ore was going to be the main metal that was going to build the railroads, build the railroad engines, build the infrastructure in many cases, iron bridges and the like, but then also build the machines needed for mechanization, industrialization, innovation. Britain had natural resources, had deposits of both coal and iron ore within the confines of its own kingdom, very close at hand, and that could be, once mined, could be moved very easily to centers, uh, factories to be processed into the necessary items for industrialization to take place. Fifth, Britain had a good infrastructure. They had the roads, the bridges, the rivers, and the canals that stitched the country together, both physically, but then also economically as well. That it was very easy to move raw materials from their extraction point to the factories and processing plants, usually located in urban centers, very easily, speedily, and at low cost. Britain also was receptive to private enterprise and the entrepreneurial spirit itself. And this means that Britain was beginning to move away from the governing economic philosophy of mercantilism, where the state and the private sector are very closely aligned with one another. And Britain was beginning to pivot, at least by the mid century and towards the latter portions of the 18th century, the 1700s, to buy into and apply the theories of Adam Smith, the classical economic philosophy that was coming online, the idea that government would actually remove itself from the marketplace and from interfering with the free market and the free flow of goods and trade policy. So, what this meant is that it was government recognizing that perhaps it was in the best interests of the state overall to have the economy, the financial sector, um, work free and clear of any type of government oversight or government interference. Again, this gets us into the free market principle, you might say. And it was very characteristic of more of a capitalist mindset that we buy into or subscribe to primarily in much of the Western world, specifically in the United States. That's so we're seeing here the um, creation and the implementation of a more free market-like society, an approach to um, you know that kind of economic system. Uh, Again, that was rather new. It was kind of converse to the norm. And so, as a result, it is another example of just how willing Britain was to kind of experiment with the unknown, to put into practice theories that necessarily hadn't had a great deal of room to, for experimentation and application. And but nonetheless, Britain was willing to kind of um, uh, tolerate that type of risk and that extent of risk. Lastly, Britain had global reach. Um, it had opened vast markets for the industrial goods it was on the verge of producing. It had the colonies, colonies in the Americas, not only the 13 colonies, but they also had places like Jamaica and other areas in the Caribbean that they could use to export their goods to. They had sites and settlements set up in Africa. They also were beginning this process and had the process well underway of bringing the Indian subcontinent under the direct control of Britain and the British government towards the latter portions of the 18th century. We discussed that in the last lecture. And then also, the British were beginning to extend their influence into the Far East, namely opening up China for trade. So, the machine made goods that Britain was going to produce provided providing cheap products that the markets wanted. Not only the domestic markets, but the markets around the world were beginning to clamor for. These were typically non luxury goods. They were focused on functionality, um, and they offered those products, those machines, at low cost because they could be churned out with such a high degree of efficiency um, and rapidity. From 1670 to 1770, excuse me, from 1660 to 1760, Britain, Britain's exports quadrupled, eclipsing both the French Empire and the Dutch Republic as far as exports were concerned. Its two main rivals, you might say, as far as uh, you know, imperial competition. This allowed Britain to reign supreme as an emerging global power. And it led to a high standard of living for Britons and also allowed the Britons to achieve the highest standard of living within Europe itself. The increased demand for goods caused businesses and their leadership to continually innovate. And this was, in many cases, the catalyst for the industrial age itself, the industrial revolution. So very very similar to the European Enlightenment, where you have in the intellectual fields a growing body of knowledge that scholars were contributing to. They were continually kind of revising and editing and reviewing the work of each other to build on that body of knowledge and improve upon it, to kind of create different corollaries, to different theories, or propose brand new ideas and test them, or have the academic institution, the academia itself, begin to try and, kind of corroborate one's findings. All of that type of mentality. Um, also was very prominent within the Industrial Revolution, that there was a core of innovation taking place, and then there would be this kind of process of building on that innovation to refine existing inventions to make them even more efficient. Or to develop them further to kind of be able to do multiple tasks, or to invent brand new technologies from scratch in many cases. And so the same kind of characteristics that were exhibited in the Enlightenment are also beginning to exhibit themselves in the Industrial Revolution. So, what were some of the industries that were most heavily affected? Well, first and foremost, one of those was the textile industry itself. This was one of the first industries to industrialize and to begin to retool in the process. Um, and here we begin to see a dramatic shift away from what was the norm, the cottage industry, and move and shift towards more of a factory-oriented industry. So, to describe a cottage industry, this is essentially where you have a small scale, largely decentralized production of goods and centers of production. Uh, Usually, it would be on a contractual basis. So, there might be a merchant who would travel around to individual households, individual cottages, and begin to deliver raw materials, using textiles as an example. A merchant might bring cotton, raw cotton, to a particular member of the household, and by contract say, okay, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I want this cotton turned into either thread or turned into thread that would then be further processed into a manufactured good, a textile. Um, and then it would be up to that individual to deliver whatever the terms of the contract were within the given timeline. And then when the merchant returned in, say, 2 weeks or whatever it was, picked up the goods, taking possession of them, usually he would pay for those goods and the services um, upon receipt. This worked for you know as far as the status quo was concerned prior to the industrial age. But what happens with industrialization is that new inventions began to accelerate the pace of production beyond the means of individual cottages, individual households to be able to turn around product in a timely manner. So as a result, um, instead of parsing out and delivering quantities of raw material to individual households. Instead, um, there were these facilities created where the raw material would be essentially warehoused, so that the cotton would remain in one location, oftentimes the same location where the machines in the industrial area would be housed as well, to encourage the massing of resources. Additionally, the coal and the iron ore necessary to fuel the machines if necessary. Doing this and having everything under one roof, as it were, allowed for the maximizing of production and efficiency. So rather than have the product distributed to various households, instead, members of those households would come to the central location, the factory itself, and work. And this is going to have profound effects. I mean, when you are working from home, as it were, in a cottage industry, this means that you're able to kind of, work at your own pace, have your own hours as far as work was concerned. Um, Work conformed more to your schedule, your personalized schedule. But when you have to travel to a central location, a factory, there were set hours of operation typically. And so as a result, this meant that there was a standardization that took place within one's personal life. And the workplace became the focal point of organizing one's life around that central pivot. And so this is going to have pretty profound social implications, as you might expect. We'll get into that in a few moments towards the tail end of this lecture. And what we'll do moving forward in the weeks ahead is to, as we talk about industrial developments, we'll see how this is kind of a continual process, almost um, rearing its head time and again throughout the modern age. This nature of, the nature of work itself and its impact on individuals, households, and society at large. Technology in the textile industry included the likes of the flying shuttle, which doubled the production of weavers' hand operated looms. So you're able to take raw material, in some cases cotton, and begin to process it into things like thread or yarn at an increased rate, a quicker rate. And so this created a ready supply of yarn to then be taken and woven into a finished product. The spinning jenny, perfected by 1768 by James Hargreaves, was able to keep up with demand as well. Later refinements by other entrepreneurs meant that these items could increase yarn production even more. Again, this enlightened like principle being applied to mechanics and engineering. And the automation of the industry itself, of course, is going to have effects on employment, as I mentioned. That instead of having individuals and the hands of individual people making the product themselves, instead the people are removed from that process, and they are now overseeing um, machines that are going to do that at a much faster rate and a much more efficient rate. And so the worker becomes the human being becomes essentially a manager of machines in certain respects, and either maintains the machines if they break down, or simply kind of feeds the machine if it runs out of product, out of yarn, say, that it needs in order to create a finished product. When you're able to take raw material and process it more quickly into thread or into a finished product, this means that the supply of the raw material, cotton in certain cases, increased as well. And so this means that vast plantations were growing increasingly wealthy off of the increasing demands being put on each individual plantation to generate the necessary product that was called for. This is going to have a trickle down or knock on effect in that uh, uh, slave labor is going to increase and the demand for slave labor is going to increase as well. By 1787, the power loom was invented by Edmund Cartwright, which allowed the weaving industry to catch up with the yarn production industry. So if you are able to take larger quantities of cotton, turn it into yarn, but then you have this slowdown with regard to actually taking that yarn and producing something with it, this is going to create a bottleneck. And so in many cases, there was a need uh, to a demand to create machines that could take yarn and begin to craft it into a manufactured good. Um, so you can see how industrialization and technological development has this kind of cascading effect across a single industry in many respects. But it's also going to mean that it would have reverberating effects across economies as a whole, as we'll kind of get into in the coming moments. By 1793, an American inventor by the name of Eli Whitney invents what's known as the cotton gin. This was a mechanism designed to clean raw cotton more quickly. So when you harvest cotton and you take it out of the husk, it is embedded within the fibers of the cotton itself are a number of seeds, cotton seeds, and before that cotton can be woven into a yarn, those street seeds have to be extracted. And prior to the invention of the cotton gin, and you can see an example of the cotton gin here in the lower corner, this wooden box. Um, that process of extracting seeds was done by hand, done by slave labor. But when Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin in 1793, this is going to revolutionize that processing of the cotton. Um, what you have here at work is essentially a tumbler in the middle of this box that has metal tines or forks coming off of it. And you would feed the cotton in one side, turn this hand crank on the side of the box, which would turn the tumbler, and those forks would grab the cotton and basically pull it through this process. And in that process, the seeds would be removed and the cotton would come out the other side, more cleaned, as it were. You run it through this cotton gin a couple of times. The seeds are largely removed, if not entirely, and you have done in a couple of minutes what might take human labor, you know, a considerable amount of time to accomplish the same end. To give you an idea as to how effective this was, um, one slave could clean about 1 pound of cotton per day with by hand. With the cotton gin, that same one slave could clean now 50 pounds of cotton per day. So that's a 50-fold increase, which meant that it was a much more efficient process that could keep up with the exponentially growing demand for cotton itself. And these had tremendous ramifications. So Eli Whitney was initially a Northerner. He came from the northern states. He was looking for to develop a technology that would actually take pressure off of the demand for slavery and the institution. He was looking for a way in which, in many respects, the machine could replace slave labor. But what happens is that now that plantation owners were able to uh, make their individual slaves that much more profitable because they could now create or produce so much more cleaned cotton for shipment. It meant that the demand for slaves actually went up in this kind of ironic turn of fate. um, so, in many respects, this demonstrates this kind of interconnected relationship between, again, labor on the one hand, in this case, slavery, and the Industrial Revolution itself. I'm going to end things there. We're almost out of this half-hour segment, so I'll come back in part two and continue on talking about the quantities and the increasing demand for product.